If you're looking for a podcast dedicated to real estate investing, personal finance, and how to navigate these uncertain financial times, you've came to the right place. Building credit, investing for your future, buying first home, starting a business. These are all goals that we want to achieve. Can it be intimidating at times? Oh, absolutely. The Perkins Group podcast is here to educate, help you understand, and craft your game plan for a fulfilling financial future. Without further ado, guys, let's get this thing rolling. Okay, episode 3 is live from the North Shore of Big Spirit Lake, Iowa, of the Perkins Group podcast, and of course, I am your host, Jeff Perkins. Welcome back, guys. Appreciate all of you that listen to this show. If you have any feedback, recommendations for future episodes, or even want to leave a comment, check us out where you can get your podcasts, whether it be Spotify, Apple, Google Play, all sorts of those websites to get your shows. Please, guys, if you enjoy this, share with your friends, subscribe to the show, and of course, rate 5 stars. Today's episode, we're going to talk about what does Jeff see, how does he underwrite, and how does he determine what is a good investment property for him. So throughout this show, guys, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through my 4-step plan of how when I say, hey, I found a property that I really like, let's run a little more detailed numbers to actually make sure that this makes financial sense from an investment standpoint. And so, like I said, guys, throughout this show, what I'm going to do is I'll go through my 4-step process to give you guys an idea of what I look for when I look for properties. Now, of course, any real estate investor, they're going to have a little bit different path to how they, determine the numbers on what the ROI is going to be on an investment property, what kind of cash flow they're going to get. And really, like I said, if it's going to make good financial sense to buy this property. So of course, right, take it with a little bit of grain of salt. My path to doing this sort of thing is a little bit different than others, but ultimately, guys, it's what I found has worked for me. With that being said, guys, let's get into it. Step 1 of my 4-step analysis to determine if a rental property is going to make sense for me, guys, is of course, what is our monthly income going to be off of the property? So the biggest thing you're going to look out for, and the one thing that I look for, you may be underwriting a property for the first time, and people always talk about like that napkin sketch kind of math that people do at a quick glance. That is very effective to give you a baseline idea. But ultimately, when it comes to actually determining what the income or the rent is going to be off that property, I actually use a little bit more advanced tools to determine a good baseline of what's going to be a good market rent for the property. Because guys, if you are out of the ballpark on what your market rent is going to be, well, then what's going to end up happening is the property is going to sit a lot vacant longer. And of course, with any real estate investment, you don't want the property to be vacant. So what I ultimately do, guys, is I go to rentometer.com to actually determine what is a good baseline for rent. The cool thing is too, I talked about in one of the previous episodes, I have a property manager in Renters Warehouse who manages these properties for me. And I actually got the recommendation from those guys. That's kind of some of the software and technology that they use to get a good idea of what the market rent is going to be. So ultimately, what I ended up doing is go to the underlying base characteristics of the property. So we talk about the number of baths, bedrooms, square footage, what the actual neighborhood that house is located in. And then that'll actually run a bunch of comparative analysis in that Rentometer platform and give you a good baseline of what you're determining for rent is either too high, it's right in the ballpark, or maybe it's too low, you can get a little more rent on the property. So of course, like I said, what I do is I use that platform first. I get my baseline estimate of what my rent is going to be. And then part of the monthly income that you have to be aware of on the property is, of course, what you're going to factor in for a vacancy rate. A lot of people will use like a 3.5% for vacancy. I think the most conservative and safest way to determine what your vacancy is going to be, and the way that I do it, is I always determine that the property is going to be vacant for 1 month out of the year. So I use 1/12, which is 8.3%. Essentially, what I have ended up finding with my properties, I've had a couple that have signed multi-year leases. I have some that have only signed a 1-year lease. When you have tenant turnover, guys, you're going to run into that situation where one tenant moves out. You have to get the property back up to spec. You have to do a little bit of maintenance, cleanup work, kind of move in, move out, tenant maintenance type things. And so what I determined is that 1 month gives me a pretty good amount of fluff built in to kind of understand, hey, I'm not going to be earning income on this property a month. So ultimately, guys, what I do for step one of this property management and how I underwrite a property is one, I use Rentometer platform to determine what my baseline rent is going to be. And then I actually, out of that, say it's $1,200 a month or $1,000 a month, whatever that may be, actually subtract 8.3% of that total value off of what that, $1,000 or $1,200 may be. So going into step two with my property analysis is this. Essentially, the second step is going to be what your monthly operating expenses are going to be on the property. Now, a lot of you would be very familiar with what those things are. We're going to talk about property management fees, property taxes, maintenance allowance, which I think the maintenance allowance is really important because it helps give you, I would say, a conservative estimate, just to be a little more careful on how the property actually does, kind of preparing for the unexpected. And then, of course, things like utilities, property insurance, and if there's anything, little miscellaneous details such as legal fees, things like that, etc. So a couple of things I look at is when I talk about property management fees, like I've talked about in this episode and previous episodes, I go through a property management company. If you're wanting to be one of those real estate investors who wants to be a passive investor after you get the property leased out, obviously after you get the property purchased, I think the property management side is super important. Just as you work through those expenses, right? So for mine, for example, is a fixed fee of $99 a month per property. Some of the other things, right? We talk about property taxes. The best way you're going to find your property taxes, if you go to the county that you purchased the property in, that county's assessor page will give you a determination of what those taxes are going to be for the property. Of course, through the properties I have in Des Moines, that is Polk County, Iowa, they actually give me a very good estimate and a true dollar value for the previous years of what those property taxes are. A couple other things I look at, so I talk about maintenance allowance and how that's really important. One of the things I use as a determining factor to actually get a dollar value for what my maintenance allowance is, what I do is I use a 1% per year of the total purchase price that I dedicate towards the maintenance expenses. So let's use a $100,000 property, for example. What I'm going to do is for each year, I'm going to allocate or budget for $1,000 in maintenance. That's going to be really important. It's just one of those conservative numbers that you want to have in place because there's going to be unexpected things that are going to happen from the maintenance side. And if you have a lot of that budgeted in already, that's going to give you a little bit of leeway on the backside as well too. A couple other things we talk about, so property insurance. You can find the property insurance. As you go to purchase a property, you're going to have a company picked out anyways that's going to service that insurance for you. They can give you a pretty generic quote. Me, for example, the properties I've done, just, if I'm not to the point where I have the property insurance company picked out, I usually throw in a dollar value of about 50 to 65 bucks a month. That gives me a pretty good baseline. And then, of course, other things we look at for the monthly operating expenses, utilities. Now, what's been good for me with my properties is I actually have all of my tenants pay the utilities when they sign a lease. Of course, when you have a vacant property and there's nobody there, then yes, of course, you will have to cover those utilities. But in the situation when someone is actually living in the property and I'm getting rent checks, they're covering all these utilities. So as I do an analysis, I usually put $0 for that kind of thing. Like I said, guys, there's going to be various other monthly expenses that would tie into kind of determining what your cash flow is going to be. There may be legal expenses. For me, on the legal side of things, that's usually a one-time fee with quitclaim deeds and things like that. But there can be a couple other things as well too. So just one of the things I said, like in step 2 that I look for in my properties is get a baseline idea what my monthly operating expenses are. And that'll kind of help you understand what your monthly rent is going to be versus the operating income. So then you have an idea if those expenses are being covered, which then leads me into the third step, guys, which is the financing or the mortgage portion of things. So as we talk about the mortgage of the property, right, unless you have a lot of cash up front, of course, you're going to need some sort of financing to actually secure and gain ownership in the property. So when I do my quick analysis in step 3 of my 4-step plan, essentially you got to look at a lot of the things that you would find in any online loan calculator. What's a home purchase price going to be? What's your interest rate going to be? So I got lucky. You guys are very familiar with how interest rates are doing here in 2024. That's going to be a really big determining factor in what the cash flow is going to be. And of course, some of these properties I bought in 2021, 2022, of course, a lot of you remember interest rates were significantly lower than what they are today. A couple other things to look at though, if you're looking for a cash flow perspective, The length of the loan is going to be really important. Generic loan is going to be 30-year mortgage. There's 15s available, things like that. Of course, when it comes to the financing piece of it too, you don't have to go through a traditional bank, but through some of the other financing avenues, which I'm actually going to talk about some of this in another episode of a podcast. You can go through hard lenders, other financing avenues that are available, but I found, at least through some of the research I've done, those interest rates aren't as favorable as actually going through a normal mortgage institution. But like I said, a couple other things to check out when it comes to the financing details of the property. Of course, what's your down payment going to be? So on a dedicated investment property, if you go through a traditional bank, they are going to require you to put 20% down in most scenarios. The way I had to buy my investment properties as dedicated investment properties was, of course, putting that 20% down of the purchase price. Another thing that's important to know, and this will actually tie into step 4 with our cash on cash return, is going to be your closing costs on the property. So as a rule of thumb, generally 3 to 5% of the purchase price is going to be what those closing costs are. And the reason why I say those closing costs kind of tie into step 4 is that cash on cash return. And so with that being said, guys, let's actually go over to step 4. So what step 4 is going to be in the 4-step plan of how I understand to analyze an investment property is going to be a lot of the financial data that's going to give you guys a better understanding of, in a decently hypothetical scenario, how the property is going to perform. So we're going to look at things such as the cash flow of the property, which in steps 1 and 2, and then also step 3, if there's a loan on the property, the financing piece of it, then you'll kind of get an understanding of, okay, when this property is rented out, the mortgage is going to be paid, and there will actually be a little bit of extra money left over. What I've done when there's a little bit of money left over as a cash flow perspective, I throw that back in my business bank account as more of an emergency reserves until I get that bank account build to where I feel pretty safe. And then, of course, then with other money that's left over, my plan is at least to reinvest that into new properties as I get more cash flow. Another important metric to look at, guys, is going to be your cash on cash return. Now, in my quick analysis at the end of this in step 4, I don't necessarily look at the total ROI. That's a little more advanced as I get a couple more years of aggregated data of how the property is truly performing after I own it. But with the cash on cash return is going to tell you, okay, what is my initial investment going to be in the property? Well, when you think about your initial investment, that's going to be 1, the down payment to actually get financing for the property. And then, of course, 2, what are the closing costs on that loan? And then a third little variable you could add to this as well would be, is there any pre-maintenance that's required? Does you need new appliances? Is there something that needs to be done to the house before you actually start renting it out? So what I ended up finding is if I can get a pretty decent cash on cash return of 7 to 8%, that's really, really significant to me because, a lot of people talk about the S&P 500 and what it annualizes and averages for returns. Now, of course, you're going to hear anything from 7 to 10%. But if I can get that property in that same window of that 7 to 10% or even higher, that's not going to factor in what am I going to get for tax savings with depreciation on the house itself? What's going to happen with debt pay down? And then, of course, is the property going to appreciate over time? Which one of the principles I'm going to talk about in this podcast is hard assets. Real estate is one of those things. If you buy it now, 30 years from now, it's probably going to be worth more than what you originally paid for it. So those are a couple of the just different variables that I'm going to look at, guys. And when I talk about the cash flow side, the one thing I try to look for is anywhere from about $200-ish a month positive cash flow. Now, of course, in 2021, when I had lower interest rates, that was a lot more significantly easy to achieve than it is now with 7-8% rates. But I do like to have a little bit left over because that also helps me factor in some potential maintenance things. Maybe the air conditioning unit breaks, maybe the furnace breaks, maybe you have a roof leak. Of course, those aren't going to be just normal wear and tear maintenance issues. Those will be those higher dollar value issues that you will have to get taken care of. So like I said, guys, that is my 4-step process on when I find a property. How do I underwrite it? How do I make a good financial decision and do a little research before I actually purchase a property? So if you guys like this podcast, we appreciate you listening. Wherever you get your podcast from, whether it be Spotify, Google Play, Apple, wherever it may be, please tell your friends and subscribe to the show and rate 5 stars. And if you want to check us out, guys, check us out at www.perkinsgroup.llc or, of course, on our Facebook page or on Instagram at the Perkins Group LLC. We have lots more episodes coming, and we're really excited to keep giving you guys good content. And as always, guys, thank you so much, and we will talk to you soon. Hey guys, if you're still listening up to this point, you guessed it. That's the end of the episode. If you have any questions, comments, future podcast recommendations, or even just want to leave a message, please check us out on Instagram at the Perkins Group LLC or on our website, www.perkinsgroup.llc. As always, we appreciate your support and please subscribe to the show on whichever platform you get your podcasts from.